The ability of animals to adapt to their environment is truly incredible. Over the last 200 years, we have witnessed natural selection in action, with bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics and insects developing immunity to pesticides. And although these adaptations occur over very short time scales in evolutionary terms, they're actually quite rapid. However, nothing beats the dramatic changes that took place when species found themselves on an island. Over the last few million years, many species have evolved into giant or miniature forms. Take Madagascar, for example. This island off the coast of mainland Africa was once connected to it. But after separating around 160 million years ago, it became home to some very strange creatures. The ancestors of modern lemurs probably made the journey from mainland Africa to Madagascar by rafting on a collection of driftwood debris. Over time, lemurs split into dozens of species, some of which grew to enormous sizes. Today, there are around 35 lemur species alive. And while none of them are particularly big, fossils tell us that there were giant lemurs around until relatively recently. Megalodopus was a strepsirrhine lemur that lived on the island between around 23 and 13,000 years ago. It was herbivore and the heaviest of the giant lemurs, weighing up to 99 pounds 45 kilograms. That's about the size of a silverback gorilla. The fossil record also tells us that another giant lemur called Babicosia lived on the island 34,000 years ago. Papagayo was about the same size as Megalodopus, but was more closely related to the Indri, a lemur that still lives on Madagascar today. Unfortunately, both giant lemurs went extinct during the late Pleistocene epoch, likely due to increasing dryness on the island and maybe because of habitat destruction caused by humans. Giant tortoises are one of the most iconic examples of island gigantism. But why do you think that is? If you thought it was because there aren't many predators on islands, then you'd be correct. Take the Galapagos Islands, for example. These islands are home to 19 species of giant tortoise, all of which descended from a common ancestor that arrived from mainland Ecuador sometime before 150,000 years ago. Compared to the ancestral population, these descendants have much larger bodies and shells. And this is thought to have happened because once on the islands, the ancestral population had fewer predators to worry about. So there was less pressure to stay small. In fact, different islands have tortoises with different shell morphologies, which reflect the variation in vegetation. But these tortoises also show a general trend towards gigantism, too. A study published in 2020 analyzed the fossil record of the giant tortoises and found that they started evolving into giants around 136,000 years ago. What's more, the rate of evolution was exceptionally fast compared to other vertebrates, especially mammals. The researchers say that this could be due to both relaxed selective pressures and abundant resources, which may have also contributed to the spectacular diversification across the archipelago. But this isn't only true for reptiles. On the island of Flores in Indonesia, scientists found fossils of a miniature elephant relative that lived there between 11,000 and 50,000 years ago. But sometimes being small comes with its own set of problems. On the island of New Guinea, there's a rainforest-dwelling marsupial lion called Thelycolio bicornis. Its ancestors are believed to have arrived from Australia around 400,000 years ago, where similar ancestors still live today. And it wasn't alone. There are around 60 species of placental mammal in New Guinea, and all but one of these can also be found on the Australian mainland. So it might seem strange that Thelycolio has only made itself at home on the island. But body size seems to be a key factor. Thelycolio averages around 4 feet 1.2 meters long, but on the mainland, its ancestors average around 8 feet to 0.4 meters long. The smaller population on the island is thought to have evolved in the past 30,000 years from a recent common ancestor with its mainland relatives. This might not sound like much time, but it's incredibly rapid from an evolutionary perspective. And scientists think that the change in size happened because of competition for resources. The smaller Thelycolio was able to exploit food sources that weren't available to the larger thylacine, such as fruits that grew on low shrubs. Being on an island doesn't always lead to gigantism or dwarfism. Sometimes it leads to gigantism in some individuals. Take the island of Socotra in Yemen, for example. It has been cut off from mainland Africa for millions of years and has around 800 endemic plant species, 90% of which can't be found anywhere else in the world. One of these species is the dragon's blood tree, which inspired the filmmakers of Avatar to create the floating Hallelujah Mountains. Socotra is also home to a very strange subspecies of Socotra sunbird. This bird has bright red plumage and a black tail with white tips. The males weigh up to 1 ounce 28 grams, which is almost twice as heavy as the females. And unlike their mainland counterparts, they have enormous, disproportionately large beaks. Scientists think that these beaks evolved as part of sexual dimorphism, meaning that the two sexes evolved differently. And the reason behind this is something called sexual selection. This occurs when the preference for certain traits in a species drives the evolution of exaggerated features. For example, male birds often develop elaborate ornaments, such as bright colors and long tails, to attract mates. But in the case of Socotra sunbirds, scientists believe that the females were the ones that evolved preferences for larger-beaked males. Larger beaks might have initially developed as a result of genetic mutations, but if females preferred these traits, then those individuals were more likely to pass on their genes and produce more offspring. Eventually, this led to the evolution of the massive beaks that we see today. It's clear that being on an island can have some pretty dramatic effects on species, leading to everything from sexual selection to dwarfism and gigantism. But what does this mean for our planet's species today? Well, as we continue to alter habitats and introduce non-native species to islands, we're putting a lot of species at risk. And this means that we're losing some pretty unique animals. For example, Mauritius was once home to a giant flightless bird called Raphis cucullatus, which was related to the white-throated rail. Fossil evidence suggests that it evolved from white-throated rails that arrived from Madagascar. But unfortunately, it went extinct in the late 17th century, likely because of habitat destruction caused by humans and predation by introduced cats and dogs. So what can we learn from the island species that are at risk today? Well, it's clear that we need to protect habitats from human-caused destruction. But we also need to manage invasive species because it's these that are often responsible for the extinction of island species. Take the island of Aldabra in the Indian Ocean. Between 136,000 and 66,000 years ago, it was home to a giant tortoise that weighed around 550 pounds to 150 kilograms. But around 136,000 years ago, the sea level rose, which is thought to have allowed invasive species to arrive. One of these was a Seychelles black fly, which is still present on the island today. When the black fly arrived, it fed on the giant tortoise eggs, which probably caused a population crash. The tortoise then evolved into a smaller species that could fit inside burrows, which were too narrow for the black flies to enter. This gave them some protection, but eventually they went extinct during the Holocene extinction event, which started around 11,700 years ago. This extinction event was caused by a sudden climate change that happened at the end of the last ice age. But it's believed that the invasive blackfly played a significant role in this. Now, managing invasive species on islands is proving difficult because most islands have been colonized by invasive species already. But there are some success stories. Following a volcanic eruption on the island of Krakatoa in 1883, rats made their way over from the neighboring island of Java. By 1920, they had caused considerable damage to crops and outcompeted native wildlife. But following control measures that began in 1927, the rat population declined significantly. And today, the island is completely rat-free. Controlling invasive species on islands is crucial because it protects native species from predators and competitors. And on many islands, this is the only way to ensure their survival. Now watch how animal migrations are changing the world, or check out this video instead.